Hi, everybody. This is Hondo Carpenter from Sports Illustrated's Fan Nation, the Las Vegas Raiders Insider Podcast. It's great to be with you today. I'm joined by my good friend as well as my colleague from the Spun.com, the one and only, the great Matt Hladek. Matt, how are you today?
Hondo, I'm doing great. Always good to start another week off with you and get ready for training camp.
We are 2 weeks into training camp, and obviously you're watching training camp from a national perspective because the Spun is a national site. I'm here every day on campus at the Raiders headquarters. And I want to talk some strategery. I want to get your input and some analysis. So first of all, uh, this week was pads, and Josh McDaniels had the team come out, and they're hitting and going to the ground, super physical. Now, you and I both know we've been doing this a long time. In fact, last week we talked about things you want to make sure you avoid in camp, and one of them is guys going to the ground and taking a chance at injuries. But they understood this team was not physical enough last year on either side of the ball, and especially on defense where tackling was not great. They wanted to send the message early. They came through it with really no scratches. I think it was a risk, but I think it was a good risk that Josh McDaniels needed to take. They needed physicality on this team, and he sent the message day one. Your thoughts?
Was a strategic risk, it's a calculated risk, so to speak, because when you look at it, like again, we did speak last week about how they don't do as much on the field. Josh McDaniels likes to do a lot of his teaching, instruction in classrooms, kind of keep guys physically preserved and keep their bodies right and fresh. But at the same time, you can't go too far in that direction because the essence of football is about being on the field. The essence of football is about hitting. So you have to do some hitting. You have to do bring some type of physicality, like you said. And I think that the way that he approached it, for me as an outsider, reading about it and you talking about it, it seems like it was a way to almost kind of shock the system, so to speak, to really get his players engaged and locked in to kind of say, okay, this is the mentality we need to have. And I'm going to give you guys, you know, time to rest your bodies. I'm going to give you guys time to do work away from the field to help you prepare. But we have to take care of number one first. We have to get down to business. And the most important thing is hitting. And again, like you said, there's always an enhanced risk of injury. There's a risk of injury every day in training camp, but that full contact, wrapping guys up, bringing to the ground enhances that. But sometimes it's something you have to take. It's a necessary evil, so to speak, or it's like the vegetables. You have to eat your vegetables. You have to kind of get that down and do that before you can get ready for the season.
And I'm going to tell you, Matt, you made a comment a minute ago about, them being more physical. It was game physical.
Mm-hmm.
And I've never seen that early in camp ever. And usually when you see it, it's in preseason games. It was phenomenal. But I'm going to tell you why I liked it. Because you saw wide receivers engaging downfield in ferocious blocks. You saw, I mean, it was just, to me, it was Josh sending a message that needed to be sent. You know, I'm going to write more about this later, but after the New Orleans game last year, when the team was terrible, the offense was terrible, there wasn't one player from coach to water boy that had a good day. It was an embarrassing loss. They knew, okay, on a day when our offense wasn't there, we couldn't get anything from our defense to spark us to get anything. They knew, all right, we've got to get more playmakers and we got to get more physical. And I just thought it was interesting to watch. Again, I thought it was a risk, but I thought it was a legitimate risk. Okay, moving on to the next strategery thing we want to talk about. I said before the year that they were going that Jimmy Garoppolo was going to be fine and ready for training camp. The biggest question was if he could go 17 games, not if he could be there at the beginning. They've been very careful with him, letting him work himself. I mean, remember, he didn't play a lot last year. He was injured, and then just letting him get healthy, which I think is really, really smart. They've had scheduled off days. Now, a lot of fans don't like it. A lot of fans are like, why have a quarterback if you have to schedule an off day? I get all of those arguments, but the Raiders are going to do nothing winning the preseason and losing Jimmy Garoppolo in week 1 or 2. He's got to be there for 17. Again, I don't have an issue with them being conservative and how they're bringing him back, scheduling day offs. Your thoughts?
We also spoke last week about their approach to preseason games and if you would let him take snaps and run the offense in a game setting. And I said I think that's a risk that probably doesn't outweigh the rewards. And I think this goes hand in hand with it. You have to manage your most important asset, and he is as the quarterback. He's not the best player, but he's their most important, most critical player on the roster because, like you said, if he stays healthy, they got a chance to be a factor in a playoff race and to maybe surprise some people. If he's not out there for most of the season, it's going to be another year like last year because Aiden O'Connell's not ready and Brian Hoyer is definitely a capable vet and a backup, but he's not the guy that you want out there starting on a week to week basis. You'd rather Jimmy G. So I think you have to do with that in mind, you have to kind of keep him fresh, monitor him, make sure that he is doing what he needs to do so that he's ready to be your starter week 1 and he has a better chance of being your starter throughout the season going to week 8 through week 18.
All right, so let's go to Tyree Wilson now. Here is a guy that was universally lauded coming into the draft. There were multiple people on NFL Network that said they thought he would be the best player in the draft when this class was done and fleshed out and careers were over. They're being extremely cautious with him. He's up, he's working out. I mean, I've been told several times, looks fantastic, looks great. They are just tapping the brakes. They understand if we get him back to start the season, we don't need him to start anyways. Put him out there in some pass rush situations, let him, get into game shape or whatever. But we want him for 10 years, not for 10 weeks. And your thoughts on how they're handling Tyree. Again, I have no argument. I support the strategery.
Well, we came in to the draft, and the reason why he might have been knocked or was knocked by some largely was health issues. He had some injury problems, and you know, people talked about he was a little raw and needed more development, but it was also that he hadn't always stayed healthy. So I think when you are having him now not fully healthy entering training camp, you're better off bringing him along slowly, taking your time so that he can potentially be ready to start the year. I think you made an important point that he's not going and probably was never going to be, the week one starter playing 70-75% of the reps. That wasn't what he was going to do. They were always going to work him in strategically and find situations for him. And hopefully, if he's playing well and he's healthy, his role will grow throughout the year. So I think the goal is get him where he's on the active roster, ready to play in week 1, and he can assist in pass rush situations. I don't know. You would know better than me if they would plan to use him on some special teams, but use him as a role player and get him up to speed there. And then hope, after a few weeks that his health is still there, and then you can start to turn him loose a little bit and give him more responsibilities on game day.
Yeah, I agree with you, Matt. Okay, I want to get to a guy and Neil Farrell. Now,
Mm-hmm.
him and Matthew Butler were rookie defensive tackles last year that we've talked about a lot. These are guys that there were portions of the season where they just didn't even dress. Raiders are like, listen, we'll pay you, but we don't need you. They worked hard this offseason, but their jobs were clearly in jeopardy. Now, I thought they would both make the roster, but Neil Farrell hasn't been out there yet. And you're seeing guys like Adam Butler, who is a defensive tackle that's making some plays. John Jenkins is making plays. Now Byron Young is back from the PUP list. He's back. He started practicing on Sunday. This isn't really strategery, but this could be a situation where I don't think Neil's faking an injury. I'm not saying that, so please don't hear that. I'm not questioning his toughness. But the best availability is availability, and it's guys making hay. Hey, Neil's not here. We're going to go out and make plays. And I'm not ready to say yet he's not making the roster, but I am ready to say his job's in jeopardy. And it amazes me how availability in the NFL is huge, is it not?
It is, especially in a game of attrition. Football's a game of attrition. There's, nobody is fully healthy by the end of the season. Everybody's got bumps and bruises and nicks. And it's really just about who can kind of sustain that more and which teams don't suffer major injuries or a rash of injuries. So, and it also, this situation kind of highlights the different, um, you know, stratification of a roster, in terms of who is on what levels of hierarchy. Jimmy Garoppolo has had injury issues, but he's a starting quarterback. So
Right.
you're now kind of protecting him because you know what his role is going to be. You know you're going to count on. Tyree Wilson is a guy who has not played a snap in the NFL, but he's first round top 10 pick. So you want him to have a future with this team. So you have to protect that future by kind of breaking him easy. Both those guys are going to be on the roster. Even if Tyree Wilson doesn't come back full strength in training camp, he's going to be on the 53-man roster. But for a guy like Neil Farrell, who's a fringe guy, who's kind of needs to show what he can do in order to not just make the roster, but carve out a role if on the roster. Missing time is like the worst thing you can do. And you don't want a guy going out there if he's not fully healthy and hurting himself more and doing things like that. But it is a situation where those type of players have to have it in the back of their minds. Like, if I want to make this roster, if I want to stick around this organization, I have to get back out there because my job is not as safe as some other guys are who can afford to kind of rehab and afford to use August as a time to get their bodies right for September, because September might not be here if I'm not competing in August.
Yeah, agree with you. Next, I want to talk about Dave Ziegler, and I'm going to be writing more about this at length coming up. But this guy went out. There is competition at every position on this roster. Arguably, the Raiders may have the deepest wide receiver core. Let's just take a second and look at that. That's just one example. Devontae Adams, the best receiver in the NFL. Jacoby Myers, a number one playing number two. Hunter Renfrow, an all-pro. Trey Tucker, Philip Dorsett, DeAndre Carter. I mean, I have people that laugh every time I say it. That's why I say arguably the deepest wide receiver core. Okay, if they keep 5 receivers like last year, they're going to cut somebody that's going to go play somewhere immediately. Then if they keep 6, they got to take someone off somewhere else. I mean, Dave Ziegler went out. There are tons of corners on this, and we're going to talk about the defensive backfield. There's tons of safeties. There's a bunch of defensive linemen, bunch of offensive linemen. I know that it's up to Josh McDaniels to now take the groceries and make dinner. But Dave Ziegler has done a tremendous job of drafting well and then going out and bringing in what we've seen a lot in New England, the middle tier free agents, the role players being cap savvy, not overspending, and getting a roster full of talent. I mean, I think that he deserves some credit with all of the discredit that people give the Raiders. Ziegler deserves a lot of credit for building a roster with a ton of competition. Your thoughts?
Well, it's like I've said before. If you can't, there's the two ways to upgrade a roster. Obviously, is to get blue chip talent at major positions, as many positions as possible. But if you can't do that, and it's not always easy to do that if you're not in a position to draft or spend for guys or trade for them too, you're better off bringing in as much competition as possible so that you have as many different guys and different skill sets that you can work with at a given position group. This way that, all right, maybe we don't have a stud at. I'm not judging the linebackers. I'm just throwing out a position group. First one that came to mind. Maybe we don't have an all-pro guy at linebacker, but we have a couple of guys that we trust, and then behind them we have some young guys or even some veterans that we know what they're capable of. They can play different roles. We can utilize their skill sets the best we can to help the team. If you're trying to, sometimes the best way to improve a position group, like I said, is to throw as many bodies at it as possible and see how it shakes out, because that gives you as many options to build up that group. You don't just go out and sign one stud cornerback, but you sign a few solid guys and you draft a couple of guys and you bring in some street free agents, and you have competition there. I think that's what we've seen a lot of teams do. I think out here in the New York area, that's sort of what the Giants did last year, and they've continued to do this year as they try to improve their roster, is bring in as much competition as possible, bring in as many different bodies and skill sets and options as possible. And I think that's what Dave Ziegler, the strategy he's going for.
All right, two more things I want to talk to you about. The next is the Raiders knew their defense lacked toughness. Now, I want to make sure this is really clear. I really like Denzel Perryman. He was a game changer at middle linebacker, great guy, but he just could not stay healthy. And so they go out and they get a Robert Spillane. The last 6 games of the 2022 season for Pittsburgh, he played every down on defense as a starting middle linebacker for Pittsburgh and every single down on special teams. Tough. He is tough as nails. Now, in fairness, going back to his time at Western Michigan, I covered him there as well. So I knew what the coaches felt about him there. He was one of those guys, don't break glass unless it's time of war. You had to take him out of, scrimmages because he'd hurt his own team, not because he was a jerk, just because he played with such intensity. Then they go get a Marcus Peters, who is a game changer, because they knew they had to get some turnovers and some sudden changes. But even bigger than Peters, they're going out and they got a Marcus Epps. This is one of the top safeties statistically in all the NFL. Philadelphia did not want to lose him. They just like Spillane in Pittsburgh, they couldn't make it work under the cap. And every time I say that about Spillane, people go mention, yeah, but look at, they paid more than he's getting paid by the Raiders for his backup. Well, for his replacement. Yeah, that's because they had lost a couple other guys and they had the money. But irrelevant. The point is they went out and got playmakers at every level, guys who match Max Crosby's intensity and Robert Spillane and Marcus Epps. And so all 3 levels of the Raiders defense now has those game changers. Meek Robertson had an interception last week in practice, and no one's going to give him credit, but Marcus Epps put him in position to get it. They picked off Jimmy Garoppolo 7 times on Friday and Saturday. And several of those were because of Marcus Epps getting guys in the right position, or Robert Spillane moving some linebackers to force guys to take a deeper route. My point is that toughness is the name of the game on Raider defense this year, and it's been a long time. I think they needed it, and I think it's we've already seen it pay off in camp, but I think it's going to make the Raiders even better. Your thought on that commitment to toughness by Dave Ziegler and Josh McDaniels?
Well, that kind of toughness, that reliability, that accountability, that's what you're always looking for on your roster. I think especially it translates to the defensive side of the ball, where you have to be tone setters. And, the Raiders defense has been their issue all last year. And, that was the main thing that they had to fix. And, I feel like it's been a while since the Raiders have had that kind of nasty, mean, tough defense all around. They've had some players that exemplify that, of course, but they haven't had that kind of commitment as a unit. It'll be interesting to see if that translates on the field come this fall, because, that will be a major step up for them. Now, of course, it's not all about that. You have to be able to get stops. You have to be able to, you're competing against in a division with 2 of the best 5 or 6 quarterbacks in the NFL. Mahomes the best. It all depends on where you rate Herbert, I think. And Russell Wilson, who it'd be hard for him to play worse than last year. I think the Broncos will be better with Sean Payton. So it's easier said than done to play well defensively against those units. But I think that kind of toughness and that experience and that reliability does go a long way to helping that happen.
All right. Last thing I want to talk to you about today, we're talking strategy in the preseason, is they have two sets of joint practices. Now, it's not uncommon to hear a one. It is uncommon to hear two. I'm not saying it isn't done, but it's not done the most. The 49ers are in town this week, and then we go to LA next week, and where they're going to be in competition with the Rams. To me, these are the most vital part of training camp. I'm going to give you some examples. So you know what? You can see where maybe some of those interceptions are where some defensive backs were able to jump routes because they knew what was coming. Now you're going to get a whole new look against people who don't know your route tree, who don't know your playbook, who don't know your sets, and it's going to be controlled. So Jimmy's going to be in there. It's going to be tough. And you're going to see a lot more this week. To me, as good as the first 2 weeks of camp have been for the Raiders, these next 2 weeks are really what is going to shape the season. We're really going to learn a lot more. I'm not minimizing the first 2 weeks, but in comparison, there is none with these next 2 weeks. I think that you go out there, I think you get all your guys, you do all of your work, the banging, the pounding, but then you turn around, and I don't want to see Jimmy in the preseason. There's several players. I don't want to see Colton Miller in the preseason. As long as I'm seeing success in the joint practices, which are live, which when those reps are live, that to me is what means it. You just avoid injury. Your thoughts?
I think you hit how you closed out those comments is the most important thing. I think you hit on it perfectly. It's a chance to evaluate your team and evaluate players individually and collectively in a more controlled setting than the preseason game. I think it's more critical for you're seeing it become more critical for teams around the NFL in recent years than preseason games because when you look at it, the first there's only three preseason games. First preseason game, it seems like the custom for almost everybody is almost no one that's a projected starter or a key player plays. It's just the way it is. Second game, you might see some more guys get a little bit of work in. In the third game, which used to be treated almost as a legit game, at least for a half. Now teams are kind of backing off of it because there's no extra fourth game. So I think when you take that into account, the joint practices become paramount. You need to see how guys play against live reps, against legit competition, but it also gives you a chance to, you never can eliminate the injury risk, but you can minimize it a little. You can at least control the situation and know what you're getting yourself into. I think they're critical. I think they're maybe the most important part of the training camp schedule in the modern NFL. I think are these joint practice sessions, and I think it's critical. It's great for the Raiders that they're getting a chance to go against a group that was in the NFC Championship game last year in the Niners, and then you're getting the Rams who won the Super Bowl 2 years ago, and obviously the roster looks a good bit different, but they still have some of those players. So I mean, we'll see. I am, and really interested to see what your observations will be and what comes out.
I'm going to tell you this, Matt. If guys aren't looking good in the joint practices, then I think you play them in a preseason game. But I think you let your stars know, listen, Devontae, you're not touching the field in preseason, nowhere near it. Colton Miller, you're not going anywhere near the field. Jimmy Garoppolo, because we're going to use you in these joint practices, but I think it's going to be a lot of fun to watch. All right, next week, man, we're going to have a lot to discuss. We're going to have, the week that was the San Francisco 49ers. We're going to be able to talk a lot about joint practices, some young guys that we've seen emerge in the preseason. I can't wait. It's always great to talk to you every week, man.
Always a pleasure.
All right, you're the best. He is Matt Hladek from thespun.com. I'm Hondo Carpenter from Sports Illustrated's Fan Nation, Las Vegas Raiders Insider Podcast, part of the Fans First Sports Network. Thanks, everybody.